At this point, socials are buzzing with fibre chat. You've heard it's good for you, you should be eating more, it's good for your health, keeps you full, yada yada yada. And it's nice that fibre's getting its place in the sun, because all of that stuff's true. But I do kind of feel like no one's quite covering how you're supposed to do it. I'm not talking about the millions of chia pudding and bean bowl recipes here, but like the easy wins, the things that you can do day to day that require little to no effort. Even how much is actually worth shooting for. For me, adequate fibre intake is virtually automatic now, and I'll give you tips on how I do that in a sec. So this video's purpose is to try and enlighten you on the how, the stuff I personally do daily to get my fibre intake without ever really having to think about it. Because engaging my brain isn't something that I like having to do every single day when I can do this stuff on autopilot. To be honest, no one ever really sat me down and talked to me about fibre. During my own fat loss phase, I was basically just told to eat 2 to 3 colours, get those on my plate, and that sort of naturally led to me eating more whole foods, and the fibre came along as a happy accident, because my focus was primarily on food volume and fullness. But once I started getting a little bit more aware, I started to see these little holes in my daily nutrition. Like I wasn't really getting any legumes or beans or pulses in, and these were sort of gaps that I wanted to fill because that's just how my brain works. And that's when I started building my approach to fibre with a little bit more intent and nicking little nuggets here and there, stuff from Zoe and stuff and places like that, seed mixes, little swaps and that sort of thing. So this is less textbook theory and more basics that I've found work. Having pulled the thread a little bit, they suit me and they also work for clients. And just before we get going, if you want a simple way to build meals that have plenty of protein and fibre in with little to no thinking, my distilled plate framework is in the description below and you can grab it for zilch. So at this point, most people are aware that they're chronically under eating protein, but it's only just playing catch up now that they're also generally under eating fibre as well. So yeah, you might be smashing your protein target, but not really getting the fibre that you need. So I've come to think of these two things as a pair, protein and plants. And fibre does loads. It keeps you regular, delays stomach emptying, keeps you fuller for longer, helps control blood glucose and stabilise your blood sugars, that sort of stuff. It feeds the bacteria in your gut and adds food volume for little to no calories, which is particularly helpful if you're eating in a deficit and trying to lose some body fat, because that's the thing that's going to take you from a place of misery to that sort of stuff feeling manageable. And a personal anecdote, years ago, I was definitely guilty of absolutely smashing the protein stuff, but not really considering fibre at all. And this was rather unfortunate for my arsehole and other loo habits as a general consequence. I didn't really think anything of it back then, but then once I came to understand fibre later on, I could look back and go, oh yeah, that was probably it. So yeah, I've come to think of protein and plants as a bit of a dream team. They both fuel that satiety and keep you feeling full. Protein tends to do that on a sort of hormonal basis, and fibre is the thing that's adding that volume side of things, adding physical bulk and generally sort of slowing things down. But if you're only prioritising protein, then not only are you leaving half of the satiety side of stuff on the table, you're leaving the myriad of other benefits that come from eating adequate fibre as well. And you're likely straining to offload all that protein too. So there are a lot of numbers that fly around, and you've probably heard the 30 gram target, which is fine as a flag point, as a marker, but it might be a little bit of a blunt instrument given how much variation there is between what people eat, the different sizes and stuff like that. So an alternative that you could sort of look at in terms of picking a target is 10 to 12 grams for every 1,000 calories that you eat per day. And that's ideal because it might come in a little bit lower and feel a little bit more achievable in the meantime, but it's also something that you can scale depending on how much you're eating and your goal at the time. But really the the sky's the limit once you're assuming that you're building things up gradually, because a lot of evidence is coming out for higher targets now. So I've seen figures of 35 grams for females up to 48, 50 grams for blokes. And yeah, I mean, given that I think the average for the UK population is about 18 grams a day, we're miles off that. So it's definitely something that you need to build up to and find ways of making it manageable and doing it incrementally. So something that I personally found useful, I'm not really sure where they're going with their stuff these days, but Zoe introduced something called like the plant framework. They introduced like the idea of points, and I think the gamifying of that, hitting that number of plants per week, just appealed to the inner nerd and gave me a little bit of inspiration on what I could do to improve my fibre intake. And the pleasant surprise with that was learning what actually counted. So different spices, different herbs. The absolute winner, the two of my favourite things in the world, coffee and dark chocolate, also contributed. That just felt like a no-brainer to me. So yeah, I took those wins quite happily. And I guess I would just finish up this bit by saying I'm not like an avid Zoe cult follower. I don't actually track my points every week. But yeah, this points per week framework or idea just, yeah, gave me some starting points or little things that I thought, oh, you know what, I could probably introduce that into my week, or I could do this with my meals and improve my fibre intake as a result. And then something similar to that came out a bit more recently from Dr. Rupi at the Doctor's Kitchen. And that almost acted as a bit of confirmation of some of the stuff that I had implemented as being decent and worth doing. And that was his framework of the BGBGS approach. So I think it was beans, greens, berries, whole grains, seeds and nuts. The idea being that if you're getting a good range of these in you across the day, then you're probably going to be hitting a decent fibre intake. So I thought I'd just run through some of the stuff that I do along those lines. Subbing in beans or pulses for like half my carbs. So say I would normally have 100 grams of rice, just plucking a figure out of the air. I might take half of that out and then swap in, a tin of beans or something equivalent in terms of calories. And that generally adds a bit of a protein boost, but also adds a reasonable amount of fibre as well. And I would do that in my lunches and have started doing that in dinners too. And generally in our house, we like to mix up the grains and the beans that we're using, because why not? But yeah, the idea is variety, so it's something that's worth considering. We also like berries at breakfast. I particularly favour raspberries, not only because I like the taste, but they're also one of the biggest hitters for fibre content. And then on the whole grain front, yeah, as I say, we try and mix them up. I remember years ago I saw an article on MyFitnessPal talking about ancient grains. And I've tried a whole host of different grains since then, but the ones I tend to keep coming back to are quinoa, because I really like it, and bulgur wheat too. And then the greens front, I always include some sort of greens with my lunch and my dinner. But aside from that, generally speaking, just prioritising whole grains over more refined ones is going to help you out longer term, particularly when it's just an easier swap. And then mixing up the sorts of seeds and nuts that you're having, just because they'll all have slightly different sort of micro and macronutrient profiles and offer slightly different benefits to your health. A side note to all that sometimes flies under the radar as well is the concept of resistant starch. So cooking up your carbohydrates like potato, rice, pasta, and then letting it cool, it changes the structure slightly to a form that is a little bit harder to digest, and acts more like fibre, which conveniently applies to reheated leftovers as well. So despite not being aware of this at the time, because I was batch cooking all my meals and reheating them for lunch and dinner and that sort of stuff, I was benefiting from this benefit without actually having to think about it. Meaning if you meal prep already, you're likely already benefiting from the same, and if you don't, it's another good reason to consider meal prepping. I should also say that when I'm talking about plants and veggies, I'm kind of generalizing all of the benefits that come from eating those as fibre. But what I actually mean is like the whole package that comes from having a varied intake. Because not only are you going to be getting the soluble fibre and insoluble fibre, so the stuff that's slowing things down, improving that blood sugar, and yeah, generally sort of keeping things moving. You're also going to be feeding that gut bacteria and getting all of the micronutrients that come from eating these whole foods. And a point to note there is I don't really peel anything either. You know, potatoes, carrots, all that stuff. I generally just scrub and wash them, because a lot of the nutrients you'll find are probably in the skin. I eat kiwis with the skin on as well, for example, because a lot of the fiber's there. And all of these little details go some way to explain why I don't necessarily suggest people jump to using a fiber supplement, because whilst that might help you hit the number for fiber, if you're not eating whole foods, you're going to miss out on all of these other benefits that you'd get from eating decent sources of fiber. So in my day-to-day, I have like a seed mix that I make virtually every week. I think it's sunflower, pumpkin, hemp, flax and sesame. And not only do I have the seed mix, but I also mix a portion of that into the nut butters that I make at home as well. So in my breakfast, I'll have oats, Weetabix or shredded wheat. There'll be chia soaked in there. Then I'm going to be topping it with berries, this seed mix. So already that's going to be like 10 to 12 grams of fibre from one meal. And then more recently, I've started experimenting with psyllium husk. So that is, I think, about 10 grams of that. It's basically pure fibre. So about 10 grams of that is 19, 20 calories, basically pure fibre. And I mix that in with my overnight oats. And it does thicken it slightly, but I absolutely love thick oats. So for me, that's a win. So if you're looking for somewhere to get a really quick, easy win, then experimenting with that is definitely worth looking into, because I think it's about as low friction as it gets in terms of tweaking your daily intake without really messing up any kind of macros or calorie targets. So by the time you start chucking in beans and whole grains at dinner at lunch, you're basically gravy. That's 3 meals where you're going to have solid protein and fibre hits, and you've not really had to engage your brain at all. So yeah, there's some really easy swaps that you could implement this week. 1, subbing out half your carbs for beans or pulses. 2, seeking some variety in the plants that you're consuming. So that could be seeds, nuts, berries, herbs, spices. And 3, exploring high fibre, low calorie options. So choosing those fruits that make it a little bit easier, like raspberries. A really goated snack for high fibre, low calorie density is popcorn, for example. And then the aforementioned psyllium husk hack. If you're doing those 3 things, I think it's pretty unlikely that you won't close that fibre gap. And if you want to see the sorts of meals that I'm talking about here, the breakfast bowls, the bean mixes, all that sort of stuff, that's all over on my Instagram. I'll show that daily on my stories and in some of my posts. So just give that a follow, Charlie's Food and Fitness. And if you found this one useful, hit subscribe and I'll keep trying to work through the stuff that helps you move the needle. And the plate checklist is still linked in the description below if you want an autopilot framework for getting meals with decent protein and fibre hits into.